Yeah.
Hopefully that works. I can't wait to hear what Dara has to say. We served on the AEFP board together as a cohort. Speaking of COVID, we came once in person, and the remainder of our term on the board was affected by COVID. And so look at Catherine and others, AEFP, you know, we plan to come to whatever in-person things the board does without us in the future. But okay, so I mean, this project is in partnership, as I was saying, with colleagues at UNC Greensboro, and is part of a larger initiative at the UNC system, which is the collection of public four-year institutions in the state, where researchers like myself are paired with a high-level administrator or practitioner leader at another institution, and are charged with rigorously studying, thinking about, and evaluating an intervention where the goal is to improve progress, performance, and completion in college. So this is one of those projects, and co-authored with Brennan, Mange, who's a PhD student of mine at UNC Chapel Hill, and Samantha Raynor, who's the Assistant Vice Provost for Student Success at UNCG. Do I have to?
Let's see.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Great. So our intervention is motivated by two stylized facts. Many of you are probably familiar with these, but just to make sure we're all on the same page with the same picture, right? College completion, the road to completion is rocky. It's not equally rocky across populations of policy relevant student groups. So you can see here gaps in completion for students from low-income backgrounds relative to their more affluent peers, students of color relative to their white peers, male relative to female students, and an overall rate of about 59% of students starting at 4 years finishing within 6 years, completing with a credential. The second, and I think very important, is recent descriptive work that shows over a third of students who leave college do so after completing 3/4 of the credits required for a degree. Just kidding. So late stop out in college is a phenomenon that is very important, I think, understudied. And these two facts motivate the intervention that I'll describe to you that was designed and then implemented at UNCG. The third sort of broad summary of the literature is this spectrum here that we're thinking of contributing to. So when we think about college going and completion interventions, I tend to characterize them along this spectrum from low intensity, low cost. So you can think of text messaging nudges, right? If I say, okay, Tim, please remember to complete this form by this date, that seems to work well in certain contexts under certain conditions. But if I say, Sonia, graduate, I mean, right, that doesn't work for higher order complex outcomes. And at the other end of the spectrum are interventions like ASAP, which was fielded at community colleges in New York, which is a multifaceted set of supports offered to students, which include Metro cards, financial aid, a peer mentor, access to faculty mentors, and those have demonstrated substantial increases in attainment. They're very costly, they're very hard to scale, right? So these are the two ends of the spectrum, and our intervention was an attempt to develop a medium intensity, we call it, intervention that still privileges face-to-face interactions with advisors, paired with information that we found missing from other kinds of interventions looking at advising, and a modest stipend. So there's work by MDRC in this space as well, and we can think of projects that we're aware of, and you can put them on this spectrum, hopefully. And we're trying to take lessons from both ends of the spectrum in the development of this particular intervention, which was termed HEART. And so our question of focus today, the research question, is the effect of a locally developed, enhanced, and I'll talk about what these pieces mean, advising intervention paired with modest financial support on measures of progress through college, performance, and completion among students partially through their college career. So we're focusing on students, as you can see in these eligibility criteria, who have earned at least 60 credits by the spring of 2020, right? So we're thinking of 120 credits as sort of the median length, most common, right, modal length to a degree. So half of that is 60. And then we're targeting students in the middle of the achievement distribution. So between 2.0 and 2.99 as of that moment in their college life. The rationale there was that below 2.0 triggers other institutional consequences, loss of financial aid, other kinds of academic interventions, and above that are a series of enrichment opportunities. Students are doing really well. And so we really wanted to focus on the middle of the distribution. We partnered with 3 schools or colleges within UNCG. You see those listed here. I'll just say those also featured into our experimental design because each school or college has a different advising model. So some use professional advisors, others faculty members are the chief advisors interacting with students. So the counterfactual or the condition that students are experiencing if they weren't offered a spot in the trial looks different across these 3 schools. And we wanted to account for that and explore that. So what was HEART? You can think about it as access to these 3 things. So the first is access to a trained advisor, and I'm happy to speak more about what that looked like, with a caseload that's roughly a quarter of what is typical at UNCG, and you can see the ratios here. The second was, this piece was developed in partnership with the financial aid office at the institution, and it's a 1-pager that provides the student an up-to-date snapshot of financial aid. So what have you used given what you've qualified for? So whether that was Pell Grant number of semesters, state grants, local grants, here's where you're at. And the intent was to have a document like that facilitate conversations with advisors when the student is thinking about planning academically for a degree path alongside financial considerations. Because one thing local practitioners were noticing was student runs out of aid, or the joint conversation around academic and financial wasn't happening, and in part because advisors didn't feel super comfortable with that. So by no means was this intended to make every advisor a financial aid expert. It was intended to smooth and open communication around financial and academic progress together. And then we see from data from financial aid that students in the treatment group were indeed more likely to go show up and actually have a meeting at financial aid. So that's at least some evidence that this is linking to an actual on-campus support. And then the third piece is a modest grant that's structured as an incentive over 2 semesters. So if a student met with their advisor twice in the fall, $150 was credited directly to the student's account at UNCG, the same for the spring. And so that was a product of a long local discussion about what's the right amount and how do we want to deliver it, and happy to talk about that as well. So I have no equations, I just have 2 red boxes. So this research design is a randomized controlled trial. So we are randomly allocating, right? We have a fixed budget, we have fixed human resources available in terms of the advisors that are part of the treatment group. And we wanted to take both lessons from prior research as well as some of the differences in the on-the-ground experiences of students, the different counterfactuals I described, right? Who's an advisor if I'm not in HEART is one. So we group students, you can think into these buckets in this manner described in the second red box. So we took data on historical cohorts of students at UNCG that precede our experimental cohort and estimated the likelihood that they completed college within 5 years as a function of a bunch of characteristics, pre-college achievement and achievement through the second year of college. In other words, prior to when they would have hit eligibility for our intervention. We grouped them into thirds, we grouped them by school, and then we grouped them by gender, leaning on a lot of prior work in higher education finds female students much more either more responsive to or to receive greater benefits from the effects of interventions in the higher ed space. And then within that group, we're randomizing, right? Half. Okay, so we're hoping to provide evidence, causal evidence on the effects of a thoughtfully designed medium touch intervention at four-year institutions. I'll say that UNCG on its characteristics looks like a lot of institutions, public four-year institutions across the country. The back half of college, as I said, has received a lot less attention in the literature, and I think even in policy discussion than access. And while both are important, one doesn't complete college by only showing up at the door. And the third that I'll talk more about is we wanted to look at, to the extent we can, given our modest sample, some differences in effects by groups that really matter for policy. And one of those is this baseline credit accrual. So in a world where resources matter, which I think we all live in that world, most of us, and we have time-limited interventions. So this is a one-year intervention. So that means if I'm a student, where that opportunity hits me in my trajectory might have implications for its effects on my performance, completion, right? If I'm a sophomore and I have the opportunity to take part in HEART, well, that could be helpful. Maybe it would actually derail me if I'm with this treatment advisor for a little bit and then I'm back to my old one. So we wanted to explore that by splitting students according to whether HEART could reasonably take them to the end of college. So if I've got 90 credits, this one-year intervention could kind of see me across the finish line. Whereas if I have fewer, right, than that, it can't. And then the others reflect the other hypotheses I just described. Okay, so who's in the sample? We've got the first column is UNC undergraduates broadly based on those historical cohorts. And then you can see who's in our experimental sample. So just quickly, our experimental sample, right, the share of Black non-Hispanic students is a little bit higher, white correspondingly lower. Students in our experimental sample relative to the student body at UNCG, a greater share come from low-income backgrounds. The achievement profile is extremely similar. And then the rest is showing you that randomization did indeed work, at least on observable characteristics, right? Our treatment group and our control group look very similar in lots of ways that we can measure that, lots of rich data that we have at our disposal. So that's good. Okay, first thing I want to show you in terms of results is we also fielded a survey to the treatment and control group twice during the intervention year. You see there, we pooled the responses to maximize our ability to learn something from these data. And the goal was to characterize contrasts in what the advising experience was like if I was in HEART versus if I was in the control condition. So you can see response rates here. Are they amazing? No. Context matters. So UNCG's normal advising surveys get response rates around 8%, 10%. So we were okay with this. There was a $10 Amazon rate. So students received an incentive for completing, and among respondents, there are no statistically significant differences in observable characteristics. Female students were a little bit more likely to respond overall, but they are not disproportionately represented among treatment respondents or among control respondents. So we say, okay, this can teach us something with those caveats about how the experience is different and maybe about some of the underlying mechanisms that might be at play later in our results. Okay, first set of neat findings, I think, is what were they talking about in advising meetings? So on the y-axis is the difference in the share of treatment students in HEART who report talking about a given topic on the x-axis minus the share in the control group. And you see the control group share reported at the bottom. So career exploration, for example, I love to walk around when I teach in this microphone. Take it with, but so we see that the control group is at about 9%, but the treatment group, right, you add 48 percentage points to that, over 50 percent are talking about career exploration. So you can see the bars that pop out are treatment students. Students in the treatment group are talking much more with their advisor about developing a graduation plan, career exploration, internships and employment, financial aid, which we would have expected given that that fact sheet is a part of the intervention. It would be a little bit odd if we didn't detect more conversations about financial aid, and then non-academic concerns. And our argument here, though suggestive, will be that the non-academic concerns is a function of them having more time to discuss things beyond just registering for courses. So the second set of findings you'll see here, all of these are interpreted as the difference. These are the coefficients on the indicator for randomization to treatment. So I would interpret that bottom number as HEART students are meeting, students offered participation in HEART meet for an average of 10 more minutes on a base of 23 minutes. That's actually notable. They're meeting more frequently for longer, and they rate their advisor's knowledge along a number of domains as stronger. And I'm happy to talk about what that instrument looked like. And they also are able to identify the advisor as a professional advisor. That question was intended to see if students noticed a contrast with the advisor that they would have seen had they not been a part of HEART, because in some schools like the College of Arts and Sciences, that's a faculty member. So we were just kind of curious, do they notice this is not a faculty, do they think it's a faculty member, or do they think it's a professional advisor here that they're interacting with? Okay, completion. So at present, we can only observe 4-year graduation, and you will see in a minute why everyone on our team is just really excited about 5-year graduation results to adjudicate some interesting findings we're seeing. But the top line estimate shows no average effect. The interesting part of the story to me right now is this difference in effects by baseline credit accrual. So there's a very large positive effect of access to HEART on 4-year completion, 26 percentage points for those who had 90 or more. So in other words, those for whom the intervention that was a year long could see to the finish line. We see this modest, marginally significant negative effect on the 60 to 90 credit group, which is really interesting. I'm going to come back to that in the mechanisms. And curious to hear thoughts about that, but that's the one that the 5-year will help us adjudicate, because it's not, this could be a signal of one of 3 things. It could be derailment, that this actually depressed overall 5-year completion. That would be bad. This could be delay. People are switching, changing what they're studying, and the 5-year graduation rates are similar across treatment and control groups. Or it could actually be a productive reorienting of what is happening in college, and it takes time for students to do that. And so we might see a positive on the 5-year completion, and we don't know that yet. And then the last thing here is just suggestively the split by male and female students. Neither coefficient rises itself to traditional levels of statistical significance, but they are statistically different from each other. And males, at least suggestively, male students are driving that 90+ coefficient. So that's interesting as well. And we've had a lot of discussions with the partner institution about those results. So, okay, mechanisms. We looked at 3 buckets of mechanisms. One is meaning what could have led to this positive for the 90+ group, not much going on for the others. It could be progress, right? Pace of credit accrual, credits earned, attempted, maybe summer course taking, academic performance. So we have GPA, course failure, withdrawal. This was during COVID, so did they use the COVID relief package? And then this was a set of mechanisms of deep conversation with the partner institution. How much are students changing their majors or minors, especially late in college? So an initial hypothesis was, well, students might be well served by changing a major if they're struggling, but some of our results are actually suggesting opposite might be too strong a term, but that among that 90+ group, some of what I'll show you is that they are figuring out ways to do well, stick it out, figure out a good path, and complete. And that requires more intensive advising. That's me speculating a bit beyond the mechanisms, but it's consistent with what we're seeing. Okay, so I'm going to show you some pretty logic model type graphs here to illustrate this. If you don't see one of these outcomes presented, it means we found a null effect on access of HEART on that thing. So for the 90+ credit group, we've got a pretty clear story here where access to HEART, we find a positive effect on credits earned, no effect on credits attempted. It's not here, right? So that means, okay, well, we should see an effect on GPA. We indeed do. So students are performing better, earning more credits, and they are less likely to change their major. And I can talk about how we operationalize that, but I'll tell you the story is the same whether we create that outcome to capture, I start with one major and end with a different major. I start with one major and end with 2. I start with 2, I end with 1. I start with 2 of these kind and end with a whole different 2. So no matter the way we think about this overarching finding stands, that they're less likely to shift what they're studying and more likely subsequently to complete. Okay, the 60 to 90 credits group, here's where we are right now. We find a negative effect of access to HEART on attempted. So students are taking about 1 or 2 fewer courses and therefore earning fewer credits. There's no effect on GPA. They're not performing worse, they're just taking fewer courses. And then they're less likely to change minors. I'm not sure what to really think about the minors. And so here's all my purple question marks. When we have the 5-year completion data, I will tell you, I will adjudicate for you the story about mechanisms, but I can't do that right now. We have a number of hypotheses, and I thought that this group in particular, this would be a great point and stage of the project to say, what else do you think might be going on, and how might we take that back and discuss it and analyze it? So I can talk about all of the things we've looked at, but that's where we are. So what do we know so far? We know that HEART increased substantially the likelihood of graduating from college in 4 years for those with roughly a year to the finish line when they were given access to it. the effects are much less clear for those whose trajectories extend beyond the life of the program. And so I think even without being able to delineate for you what's the story right now with the 60 to 90 credit group, I think the findings we do have suggest careful thought by institutions about how we target time-limited programs. So when cost is a concern, but we want to pilot and enhance the back end of college, who has access and when they have access to that program stands to shape benefits or potential negative effects of such interventions. And yeah, we've got a pretty clear story for the 90 plus group. We're doing a little bit more nuanced analyses around what some of these mechanisms mean or look like, but there's stronger performance, more credits earned, reduced likelihood of late in college major changes, which can be detrimental. And at least here we see evidence consistent with that notion. And I think as we go to the policy landscape, they, as a whole, results highlight the potential promise of prospective, partnership designed, context-informed interventions like HEART, but also some of the unintended or things we want to be wary of and aware of as we design and target and offer opportunities to students. Okay, so we are continuing to follow students. I tell everyone at UNC, right, randomized controlled trials have their benefits and they have their drawbacks. And one of those is that people need to age into outcomes. So we are waiting for people to do that. We have unique data that we're also looking at that are anonymized case notes or advising notes, but only for the treatment group. There's no comparable source of information for the control group, but still we can look at the notes from the 60 to 90 credit group and the 90 plus group. And there's nothing striking there, but I think it's still worth probing a little bit more. And then I'll just show you close on costs. So we've collected direct cost information and scaled this in comparison to a number of other interventions in the field. This is just, you should think of this as direct costs per participant year. Some of these interventions are 1 year, some of them are 2-year interventions, but this graph is cost per participant year. And you can see that HEART is on the lower end, and we're hoping to get some more data from other interventions that have very strong research designs capable of offering causal results, but don't report costs or don't report enough information about costs that we could put them on the graph. So we're working on that. And that's it. I think I'm almost right at time. Okay. Oh, and that's the fact sheet. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks to everyone at Calder for all the hard work in putting this together. It's a lot of fun to be back. So this is middle school principal effects on cognitive and non-cognitive skills in post-secondary schooling, employment, and engagement with the criminal justice system. And it's joint work with a bunch of people. And of course, Rick is on the paper, so he's not forgotten for the afternoon. So let me get started. And there's been a lot of interest in school leadership, kind of a lot of controversies in the, among empirical research. I think that we have a sort of sister paper that speaks directly to some of the more recent critique and finds clear evidence of variation in principal effectiveness at raising achievement. And this work then is going to tackle the broader question of principal effects on longer term outcomes that we really value, because, ultimately test scores just, they're important because of their relationship with other things, not just themselves. So historically, maintaining discipline and managing operations have been a primary focus of school principals. The PE teacher that was a natural sort of career progression. But more recently, instructional leadership has become a central part of the work. And we're going to investigate the contribution of middle school principals to post-secondary schooling work and the probability of involvement in the criminal justice system. And we're going to follow some recent papers in how we go about trying to do this. So we're going to build on work by Raj Chetty and co-authors, Carabo-Jackson and co-authors who have looked at teachers and schools respectively, and have looked in the case of Chetty and co-authors on earnings, and in the case of Carabo-Jackson alone, and then with other people on outcomes at younger ages. We recognize the importance of I'm going to use non-cognitive skills. I know a lot of you hate it, but I'm sorry. So you could think of socio-emotional skills, all the things that encompass the various kinds of behaviors. And we're going to use a two-step approach to account better for confounding factors. So when Chetty did the work using New York City data, they made the argument that we could compare the earnings of students who are with Ms. Johnson, Ms. Johnson's class versus students in Mr. Reed's class, and estimate directly the variation, in the effectiveness of these third and fourth grade teachers at raising future earnings. But the problem that they highlight is that doing it this way really raises the possibility that there's lots of things that differ about the kids in, Mr. Reed and Ms. Johnson's classes that could make it so that earnings differ in 20, 25 years. So they made the argument that what they really need to do was estimate value added to achievement tests, and then almost rank teachers on that value added, and then see if those estimates of teacher contributions to achievement growth are related to future earnings. And it's only through that one channel that they allow these third and fourth and fifth grade teachers to affect earnings. And they find substantial effects of a substantial variation among these teachers in New York City on future earnings, so that it really does matter, who your elementary school teacher is. And what we've done is following, similar to what Carabo-Jackson has done and some other people more recently, is that we're now saying, well, it's not only look at value added to achievement, we're going to look at value added to non-cognitive skills. And so as our outcomes, we're going to look at absences, which you might think of as engagement in, showing up and all the skills that are related to that. And then disciplinary infractions, which might be, things like, ability to manage emotions and things like that, self-control. And so we look at middle schools, and middle schools in Texas could be 6, 7, 8, or 7 and 8. We're not looking at schools where grade 9 is also in the middle school. And we're going to allow middle schools principals to affect the longer term outcomes only through their direct effects on these 3 measures of skills. So we estimate skill value added in a very standard way. And that is, we have an outcome, let's say 7th grade average math and 7th grade math and reading score, and we estimate it on math and reading scores in 5th grade. Think of these as just schools that have 6, 7, and 8 grades. Number of absences in 5th grade, probability of receiving a disciplinary infraction in 5th grade. So we're controlling for the student's behavior prior to getting to middle school, kind of where they were at in terms of these various skills, some demographic characteristics, and then the difference in terms of how well kids do in a class relative to what you would predict they would do on average, given where they started and their other characteristics, is our measure of the effectiveness of the principal at raising the skills in these various dimensions for this cohort of kids. And by the way, I want to tell you, we haven't talked about the data yet, but we only include principals in the study who work for at least the number of years that middle school lasts. So in a 6, 7, and 8 middle school, the principal has to be in the school at least for 3 years. And we only include cohorts of students who, if the students had remained in the school, they would have been there under the same principal for the entire time. So the other paper we do takes advantages of principal turnover, and it's done in a very different way. But this one is really, we're looking at the long-term effects, and we're looking at relatively stable schools, and I'll share with you a little descriptions of what makes them a little bit different. So all value-added estimates condition on absences, disciplinary infractions, and achievement in the final year of primary school. One of the things that we worry about is that achievement and absences are high-stakes outcomes in Texas, particularly achievement. And so you might worry that a middle school principal is going to work with their teachers to raise test scores during middle school in ways that are kind of strategic and may not be too much related to, you know, kind of really deeper learning. That's actually what's valuable over the longer term. So we measure value added to skills in two different ways. First, we use what's happening in 7th grade. We can't do 8th grade because there's a lot of selection into algebra or other classes. So we use 7th grade and we use 9th grade. So we'll measure the effectiveness of a middle school principal to raise 9th grade achievement. Now, of course, these kids are in high school for a year, so it makes it a little bit noisier, but it gets at more of their effects on deeper learning. And some of our methods actually account for high school by year fixed effects, which essentially means we're comparing the outcomes of kids who went to different middle schools that feed into the same high school. So some of that noisiness about not being able to measure what's happening in 9th grade is less of a problem. Okay, and so you know what, I'm going to skip this. I mean, we do a lot of the standard things. We use Bayesian shrinkage to reduce the attenuation bias due to noise. We use what's called a leave one out estimator. So this is kind of interesting. You know, you do the exact same thing as the initial example I gave you. You might be worried that this year's, you know, entering 6th graders into Jefferson Middle School happen to be just kind of really good for unobserved reasons. And so the principal, it's going to look like this principal does a really good job. And they're going to have very good long-term outcomes. And the problem is there's some unobserved stuff that raises, you know, their value added to skills and improves their long-term outcomes. So one way of dealing with this, as long as these things are kind of random from cohort to cohort, is to use next year's and last year's 6th graders, follow them through middle school, use only those 2 cohorts in the construction of the value-added measures, and then take those value-added measures and see if they predict the outcomes of our middle cohort. So that way we kind of separate out and deal with that problem. It turns out it looks like it's kind of a big problem for teachers, the estimation of teacher value added. It doesn't seem to do almost anything for us in terms of value added of the principal, where the samples are much bigger, the number of kids in the school are much bigger, and there's no sorting of kids in the classes. Okay. So we regress each of the outcome measures on the 3 value-added measures and controls. So first, we look at the probabilities of ever being arrested, having a guilty outcome, and being incarcerated just for males, because females commit far, far fewer crimes. All offenses and only serious misdemeanors and felonies. So we do it twice, once with all the offense categories and the second one with only more serious offenses. The means are 12% of the students have at least one arrest, 12% of the males have at least one arrest, 11% have a guilty finding. It means either there's a plea, could be no contest, or they're found guilty at trial. And 2% are ever incarcerated. College attendance and persistence for at least 3 semesters. So do you touch college, or is the first measure and you go to college for at least 3 semesters is the second? The means are 54%, 35% respectively. This includes females. And then we have strong engagement with employment and school. This was SEM when my dissertation advisor, Finance Welch, said schooling, employment, in the military. We don't know if the students end up in the military, so we just have schooling and employment. So Do you attend college or work in 6 of 8 quarters after the expected graduation? So there's 8 quarters over the 2-year period. The mean is 59%. Okay, and the outcomes are measured in the 2-year period after expected high school graduation, based on the date the student goes to middle school. So we control for skill measures. We control for differences in average time and variant differences in middle schools with middle school fixed effects. In those specifications, essentially, we're looking at how effective is the first principal who we observe in that school relative to the second principal, relative if we observe a third principal to the third principal. And then alternatively, we control for high school differences that can vary over time with high school by year fixed effects. And these are important too, because they can account for differences in regulatory practices with regard to handing out disciplinary infractions, local labor markets at the time these kids would have been expected to graduate from high school, and even some things, time varying things about that are common to the feeder middle schools to the high school. We account for selective student transitions out of the school. Kids who leave middle school for another school are very different than the ones on average who stay, by estimating intent to treat models where you're treated by a principal if you started in this middle school that they were principal of in 6th grade, regardless of whether you left for somewhere else in Texas. If you leave Texas, or there's not many private schools in Texas, but if you leave the state, obviously we can't track you. And you just leave without specifications in some. We've got 4 different administrative data sets. We've got the elementary and secondary school data. We've got the higher education data for Texas public and many private schools. We combine that with National Student Clearinghouse data for kids who leave Texas or go to a school in Texas that's not covered in the state data set. We have data, computerized criminal history data on arrests, court dispositions, and incarceration from the Department of Public Safety, and employment data from the Texas Workforce Commission. And those are the sample dates. So I'm going to just share with you a series of estimates. The middle school fixed effect estimates, and what I'm not sharing that I do want to tell you is that if you look at the value added to achievement, and you look at the correlation between a principal's value added to achievement and their value added to behavior. So something like absences or the probability of receiving a disciplinary infraction. If you use 7th grade, the correlation I think is -0.16, which is, to the value added to absences, the value added to test scores. So it's positive in the sense that if you're better at reducing absences, you're also better at raising test scores. But if you look at the 9th grade outcomes, that correlation doubles to 0.32. And I think that's consistent with this idea that better, more effective principals all around are principals not only who improve students' behaviors when they go to high school, but improve their academic achievement when they go to high school. So they've really worked with them on things that are persistent. They've really helped them develop those kinds of lasting skills. Okay, so what you can see here is in the probability of absences, what's really important here is, in terms of how a principal can affect engagement in the criminal justice system, be arrest, guilty, or probability of incarceration, is their effects on absences in 9th grade. That principals whose students have lower absences, conditional on where they started when they started middle school, are less likely to commit an arrest, and the magnitudes of 1 standard deviation decrease in the value added to 9th grade absence, so a day and a half, decreases the probability of arrest by about 1%, the probability of being guilty by about 1%, and the probability of incarceration by about 0.2%. You can see it in standard deviation terms. All right. Now, if you do it for serious misdemeanors and felonies, the estimates are almost identical. And for the incarceration category, that's not at all surprising because you only get incarcerated for more serious offense, not only, but almost only. Okay, so the middle school fixed effect estimates of the effects of principal value added on the probabilities of attending college, persisting in college for at least 3 semesters, and attending college or working in 6 out of 8 quarters. And what you can see here is where test score value added comes in very strongly. So this is value added to 9th grade test scores for all of these outcomes. And I think the differential importance of value added to the cognitive skills is really, visible for persisting in college. Okay, and less salient for attending college or working. Both of them are very important. Okay. And the effect sizes are, you could see 1 standard deviation, decrease in 9th grade absences, at the top. I'll let you can read them yourselves. I think the larger one, a standard deviation increase in value added to 9th grade achievement, increases the probability of attending college by 4 percentage points, persisting in college by 4 percentage points, and either working or attending college 6 of 8 quarters by 2 percentage points. So I think this notion that, that cognitive skills aren't very important is just, it doesn't really hold up here. And one of the things, the asides, is that if you run these regressions without the National Student Clearinghouse data, so you miss the kids who you count as not going to college, the kids who have left the state, the estimates are much smaller for the cognitive skills. Okay, so if we look at heterogeneity by race, the probability of engagement with the criminal justice system is much higher for Black males than for non-Black males, for potentially many reasons, including differential treatment by law enforcement. There are also large schooling and employment gaps by race, and extensive middle school segregation. And what you can see here on the left, and I've bolded the places where the differences are much larger, is for incarceration. The effect of absence value added on incarceration is 4 times as high for Black males as opposed to non-Black males. And the effect of getting a disciplinary infraction is also substantially higher for Black males than for non-Black males. And it's a very similar pattern. It's restricted to serious misdemeanors and felonies. And at the same time, if you look at schooling and work, you see very little in the way of racial differences. So I think that it's really, in the engagement with the criminal justice system where the heterogeneity becomes visible and important. Okay, so, this is just saying it's 4 times larger for Black males, the standard deviation decrease in value added to absences. And the disciplinary infraction is also much larger, and no evidence that higher achievement value added to cognitive skills reduces the probability of arrest, a guilty outcome, or incarceration for Black males, really, or non-Black males. So that is certainly one place where behavioral skills, the effects of the middle school principle of the middle school and behavioral skills are more important, okay, than effects on achievement. All right, that's just repeating that. Effects of test score value added tend to be larger for college attendance persistence, while effects on absences tend to be relatively larger for the probability of engaging in the productive activities of school or work. Now, just for methodological things, the leave one out and non-leave one out estimates are very similar, indicating that any biases introduced by cohort-specific unobserved student factors are small. Significant estimates with the inclusion of school fixed effects, and I haven't shown you high school by year fixed effects, suggest that the estimates capture principal effects on skill development and not, unobserved school differences. There's still the question of time varying unobserved school differences. Some of those are captured by the high school by year fixed effects, which those estimates are as larger in general than the middle school fixed effects. little difference in the findings by grade at which skills are measured and outcome specifications that include these fixed effects. And a focus on more serious crimes doesn't really affect the estimates very much at all. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure if this is good for me or bad for me, but maybe 80% of my presentation is going to be what you just heard. So we're going to do exactly that, except estimating teacher effects instead of school effects. If you like hearing about leave one out estimation, then it's your lucky afternoon. Oh, and I should say this is joint with Dan, James, and Roddy, and we're grateful to IES for funding, and this does not represent the opinions of IES or Dusty of Massachusetts. This is a CALDER working paper, so please go check it out if you're interested. Okay, so here's the first slide that is mostly obsolete now. So I don't have to convince anybody here that teachers are important for student outcomes. Traditionally, test-based value added, for what we usually just say as value added, which is the extent to which teachers affect student test scores, is primarily how we have captured the ways in which teachers impact the outcomes of their students. And most of what we know from research about the teacher workforce is based on test-based value added or test scores in some way. For example, how quickly do teachers improve over time as they gain experience? Well, most of our answers to that are based on how quickly their test-based value added improves. How effective are teachers based on different pathways, or whether they entered by passing a licensure test? All these different questions, the bulk of research that exists is based on test-based value added. And if you've been sitting here all day, I don't need to convince you that maybe there's other things that we should be looking at, but that is the message of this slide in this paper, is that there are other things that we can measure that are contained in state administrative data that also capture ways in which teachers impact the outcomes of their students. A lot of the recent research that has done this, like the paper we just saw, has been to, instead of using test scores, use something else that is contained in administrative data, such as absences, suspensions, course grades, or whether students repeat grades. Basically take the standard value added approach, and instead of estimating gains in test scores, we estimate differences in these other outcomes for students. The Kirabo-Jackson paper that was also mentioned in the last talk, which a lot of recent papers have followed, takes a composite of these four outcomes, basically compresses them into one number, estimates teacher value added to this, and finds that value added to this outcome predicts high school graduation and whether kids intend to go to college. And since then, there's just been an explosion of research looking at these other outcomes, value added to non-test outcomes, and has found that non-test value added is predictive of interaction with the criminal justice system, whether kids graduate from high school, and all these other outcomes that are not necessarily well predicted by teacher test-based value added. So this is the motivation for looking at other things. And another pattern is that of this work is that test-based and non-test value added are only weakly correlated for a given teacher. So this is important because let's say we imagine a world where there's only one dimension of teacher quality, and teachers are either good or less good, and students taught by good teachers tend to have high test scores, tend to have low absences, low suspensions. And if this were the world that we were living in, and we already collected test-based value added, then we wouldn't be missing that much by not also collecting non-test value added. But that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be the case that for any given teacher, the correlation between test-based value added and non-test value added is pretty low. And this is another reason to be casting our net in a wider way and capturing things that are not only measured by test scores. Why might this be important or useful? As I mentioned earlier, a lot of what we know about teachers in this country is based on how they affect the test scores of their students. But there are a lot of questions that we might also want to know the answer to in ways that are not only measured by test scores. For example, there's this came up in an earlier session. There's a large literature on the null effects of teacher professional development as measured by impacts on student test scores. And the vast majority of this literature is based on student test scores. But it could be the case that that professional development shapes teachers in ways that impact other outcomes of their students that are not solely test scores, but we just don't know. And also when we're investigating the impact of an intervention or something that happens, perhaps COVID, we have a lot of evidence based on test scores, and this is very important, especially since test scores have the advantage of being vertically scaled, and we can say whether students have progressed to a point that they want to progress to, but it could also be important to measure whether they're at school, whether they're engaged in school to the extent that they were before COVID. Those are just a couple of examples. And before I keep going, this last bullet is for anybody who's very nervous about using this in any sort of accountability teacher evaluation framework. I completely agree. There's the outcomes that we're going to talk about are a lot more easily gameable than test scores, which even then have been found to be manipulable to some extent. But one could imagine that if we were a school district and we said, okay, the course grades of your students are important to us, and we're going to hold you accountable based on that. Well, we could imagine what would happen, and that would make the course grades less useful as a measure and possibly induce other problems. So right now, this is research. This is trying to look at properties of a measure and trying to learn more about the teacher workforce, and not me saying that we need to introduce this in our accountability systems right now. So what we're going to do is we are going to take teachers of students in grades 7, 8, and 10 in Massachusetts. Why this strange mix of grades? Well, what we want to do is for every teacher in our sample, we want to be able to compute test-based value added and not test value added to be able to compare them. So that means we have to have test scores for students. So that's why there's, for example, grade 10 and not grade 9. There's no 9th grade testing. And then when we construct the non-test value added, we include course grades, and that's not collected for younger students. So that is first available in 6th grade, and we need to use 1 grade as a prior year control. So that's how we end up with 7, 8, and 10. Like Jackson and a lot of other studies, we use a non-test factor that's absences, suspensions, course grades, and grade repetition or grade progression. We use factor analysis to compress this down into 1 measure, and then just like with a test score that's a measure, now we have a non-test factor that's 1 measure for each student in each year in this sample. So we're going to construct value added, and then what's now going to be very familiar after the last session is we're going to link value added to later outcomes of students. Okay, this wasn't planned, but just since the last paper was so similar, how I'm conceiving of the difference between what we're doing and what we just saw in my head based on the 20 minutes I've known about this other paper is that, so yes, we're doing teachers instead of principals, but another big difference is that all of the models, everything we do is looking at differences within school across teacher. So this, where Steve's paper that we just saw is talking about differences induced by principals across the whole school. We're doing everything we can to try to remove any school level factors or changes and only comparing teachers to other teachers within the same school. So to the extent we find different estimates, in addition to being, because we're looking at teachers rather than principals, we're also only looking at within school comparisons, which is a different unit of comparison. So our contribution relative to what is out there already is, first, we replicate what is now a lot of papers that look at non-test value added on future secondary or high school student outcomes. What we're adding here is looking at non-test value added versus post-secondary or college outcomes. What we find is that, like, let's see, what did I write here? We replicate what other papers have done for the secondary outcomes. For college outcomes, we find that non-test value added predicts college enrollment and four-year college enrollment, while test value added is more salient for kids at the top of the distribution, where this predicts whether you go to a selected college. But if we look at a 1 number continuous measure of overall college quality, we find that both test-based value added and non-test value added are predictive of this measure. And for any given teacher, they're weakly correlated. So to sum up, they're both important, but they are different for any given, or not any given teacher. They're knowing the test-based value added of a given teacher does not give you much information about how good they are at raising the non-test outcomes of their students. Here's probably the most identical slide to the last talk, which is how we construct value added. So first we obtain an expectation of a student outcome, whether it's the test score or the non-test measure, based on a regression where we have everything we can see about a student coming into this year. We predict what their test score or non-test measure should be. And then their residual is the difference between that prediction based on what we saw about them before and what we actually see. Now we average these residuals to the teacher level instead of the school level. So this is the difference from the prior paper. And then we do the magic leave one out or jackknife or out of sample forecast. So all of these terms mean the same thing for, I thought Steve described this really well, but when we're estimating the relationship between test-based value added or non-test value added and a later outcome, we need to make sure that we're not using the same students in the construction of the value added and the long run outcome. Otherwise, we run the danger of mistakenly attributing a causal relationship between value added and the long run outcome to what is actually just shocks in the students that a teacher might happen to teach in a given year. And then the last step is to divide by standard deviation of teacher effectiveness. So everything here is going to be scaled in terms of what is the relationship between a 1 standard deviation increase in teacher value added, whether it's to test or non-test, and some future student outcome. Here's a obligatory plot that was introduced in the Chetty et al. Paper mentioned in the last talk. And this is kind of a calibration exercise to make sure that when we are doing our construction or forecast of value added, we are actually doing it correctly. So here is, so what is this saying? This is saying that students assigned to a teacher with high value added in a given year actually tend to have test scores that are higher than average in a given year. And the test for bias introduced in this Chetty et al. Paper is that the degree to which your forecast is biased is, sorry if anybody watching the recording this, is how far away this coefficient is from 1. And like every paper that's been done with test score value added, we get pretty much dead on 1. And then for the non-test factor, which is new, we get pretty close to 1 with much larger standard error, which will show up later when I show you our actual estimates. Now, this doesn't prove that our measures of value added are unbiased, because we can still observe this relationship if there were something like persistent sorting of teachers to students over time. So another test that we do, and that is also introduced by Chetty et al., is look at, for example, teachers that switch across grades within a given school or across schools. And what we would expect if we're actually measuring something inherent to the teacher is that if a high value added teacher left one school and went to another school, we would expect the receiving school to have increases in test scores or in non-test value added. This is another test we do that is in the paper. And again, there's very large confidence intervals around the non-test stuff, especially, but we can't say anything that really gives us red flags in terms of what we're constructing. Okay, so here's the results slide. So this is showing, all of this is showing the relationship between a 1 standard deviation increase in test value added, which is whatever color that is, aqua, and the student outcomes, or a 1 standard deviation increase in non-test value added student outcomes. All of these are scaled to be in terms of standard deviations of the outcome, because otherwise they're not in the same units. For example, SAT score in graduated high school. So the interpretation here is a 1 standard deviation increase in teacher value added versus a X standard deviation increase in the student outcome. If focusing on the post-secondary outcomes, which is really the new stuff here, we see that the non-test value added is predictive of whether students go to college and whether they go to a 4-year college, while that's not true for test scores. And again, this is somewhat different than the last paper we saw, but we are estimating from different sources of variation because everything we're doing is within school, and we're also looking at teachers relative to principals. And you can imagine many stories where principal effects and teacher effects on eventual college might be different for various reasons. If we look at the bottom two lines, we see that test-based value added is predictive of whether students go to a selective college and this overall college quality index. And non-test value added is also predictive of the overall college quality index. So again, if we were just picking out one result from the paper to say, like, here's the result that tells the story of the paper, it'd be the very last line. So both test and non-test value added are predictive of whether students, or of the quality of the overall college, if they go to college, that they actually go through. How much time do I have left?
About 5 minutes.
Okay, I still have a whole other paper to talk about. So, all right, I'll try this. So one pattern that comes up in this paper is that the student outcomes most sensitive to test-based value added are outcomes more relevant for students at the top of the distribution. So this is something like whether you attend a selective college. We tried to dig into this some to try to figure out what was going on and found a couple interesting patterns. So the first one is that if we look at the impact of a 1 unit change or 1 standard deviation change in value added versus, or based on where in the achievement distribution a student was, we see that for test-based value added, increasing a teacher's test-based value added tends to have a larger impact on students' test scores for students at the top of the distribution. While the opposite is true for non-test value added, which is the downward sloping line on the right. The other potential explanation for differences that we're seeing is, so these plots are ignoring teachers altogether. This is just for student level short run outcome on the x-axis versus long run outcome on the y-axis. And for example, if we look at attending college for test scores, which is the upper left plot, we see that if we think of students at the top of the distribution being most sensitive to test scores, and we look at the impact of increasing their test score on the likelihood of going to college, we see that once students hit a threshold, they're basically all the high achieving students are going to college anyway. So if you, at least in this sample, if you increase a student's test score from 1 standard deviation above average to 2 standard deviations above average, you're basically not moving the needle at all in enrolling in college. And we think that's part of what's going on, why we're not finding a relationship between test score value added and college attendance. Okay, so that's paper number 1. This one, it's going to be very quick. This is a CALDER working paper. So if you're interested, please check out the paper, and I'm going to try to sell this in 1 slide. So, to this point, the message has been there are other things that things other than test scores that matter that we should try to be capturing. Before, we were looking at things captured in administrative data that we could use to construct what we call non-test value added. In this paper, we have the great opportunity to be able to use a survey collected by Massachusetts, which is the Views of Climate and Learning Survey. This is a survey that is administered to students as part of the end of year testing. And there are 3 dimensions of this survey, which are engagement, safety, and environment, which DUSI calculates the scores as well as an overall score. And you can probably guess where this is going, but in addition to test-based value added and non-test value added, well, now we have something else, so we can estimate climate value added. So we estimate climate value added and look at relationships between climate value added and other student outcomes. We see that again, climate value added is not highly correlated with these other measures of value added that we have. So each of these measures seems to be capturing something distinct but important about teachers. And we find that students taught by teachers with high climate value added tend to have higher test scores, miss fewer days of school, and have higher course grades. And I'm going to leave off with a puzzle is that, which is something that we did not expect coming into this, but climate value added seems to be more strongly related to test-based value added than non-test value added. So that is to say, if for a given teacher, knowing their climate value added tends to tell us more information about their test-based value added than their non-test value added. And at least I personally find this surprising because if you think about what goes into perception of school climate and these factors that aren't captured by test scores, I would have thought that whatever it is inherent to teachers that makes their students score higher on course grades, miss fewer days of school due to being absent. I would have thought that that'd be more strongly related to whatever it is that gets their students to report feeling more engaged or safe at school. But at least so far in our preliminary analysis, that has turned out to be not the case. Okay, so wrapping up, all of these measures of value added seem to be important, but different. There are more things than test scores, and if you have these in your data, then might as well make use of them. The last part is that there are two caveats I want to include. One is that I mentioned already about accountability purposes. We're very much in the stage of finding out more about these measures rather than having clear ways of using them. The last caveat is that, at least for our measure, a lot of the usefulness of non-test value added seems to be driven by having course grades. And this is a little bit unfortunate for a couple of reasons. One is that, at least when I was thinking of non-test value added at the going into this, I thought, oh, this is great. We can capture so many more students or so many more teachers because we don't have this tested grades and subjects restriction, which is true. But if we need to have course grades, then at least in a lot of states, these aren't available or given until sixth grade or higher. So it's still a limited subset of teachers that we can actually do this for. Okay, I think that was everything I wanted to say. So,
Do we know if we have a reactor?
Dan, can you hear me?
Yes. Amazing.
There we go. I could hear you. I heard your question.
Awesome. Thank you, Dara.
You're very welcome.
You've got the floor. I'm gonna stand here and act as I think you would be acting if you were here talking.
I almost don't want to see this.
No, you don't. Oh, good. We see you now too.
Oh, great. Okay. I didn't realize you couldn't see me to start off with. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to the authors for sharing the papers. Thank you to CALDER for the invitation. Thank you to AIR and CALDER for facilitating a 10 p.m. switch for me last night. I was supposed to be there in person, but now I'm clearly on Zoom. I was super excited to be. Oh, now I lost the video feed from the room. I can't, now all I see is myself. So if I could get the room back, great. Otherwise, I know I'm not actually talking to myself. But thank you for facilitating that 10 p.m. switch. I was super excited to be back in person. Steve, Hemelt, and I were talking about this. We were face-to-face last night about how our AEFP board time was almost entirely virtual. Turns out my kids are also at the age where they can't stop licking stuff. So they are both homesick today. So thank you to the panel and thank you to Dan and to CALDER for pivoting and being super flexible with me. I didn't hear any intros, so I'll introduce myself just in case that didn't come across, but I'm Dara Shah. I'm the former executive director for research at the Maryland State Department of Education, and I am the current research director at the DC Education Research Collaborative, which lives at the Urban Institute. This session linked these 3 papers together because they all look at long-run outcomes, and they all look at something, whether that's a formal program or exposure to a teacher, where the impact is, they're looking at impact that extends beyond the duration of the thing, beyond the duration of the exposure. But instead of talking about that, I'm going to talk about some other common threads because the authors did a good job of talking about that themselves. And I'm going to filter that through my experience over the past however many years doing action research as a practitioner and with practitioners, and action research co-designed by practitioners. So my thoughts are hopefully relevant, not just to, I want to call you all Steve, even though I know that's not right. Sorry, Ben. The takeaways are hopefully not just relevant just to you, but also to the rest of the folks there, because I know that all of you really care deeply about the way that research and practice interact. So first, through that practitioner lens, I appreciate that you all acknowledge that the timing of interventions and exposures are really important, that students could be exposed to, quote, the right teacher or the best program, but if it's not at the right time, it doesn't matter how great the program is or how effective the teacher is. So I applaud all of you for thinking about the way that you considered the timing of your of the exposure, whether that's late in college or earlier, what the grade level of the students, and acknowledging that's really important. Also, practitioners realize that who receives the intervention or program is just as important as what the program itself is. So I really appreciate the way that the authors looked at differential impacts on various groups, students who are closer to finishing college versus a little further out, and really grounding that in some kind of theory about why they thought there would be a difference. Students who are at the higher end of the achievement distribution versus not at the higher end of the achievement distribution, and again, why you thought there might be a differential impact there. I'll say more about that towards the end of my remarks, but again, I thought that was a really important commonality for all the papers. Practitioners also realize that the agent is just as important as the subject. Nothing works out of the box. It doesn't matter how amazing the program is or how well designed anything is. This was especially important in the first paper, the HEART program. The HEART program was designed, and this is a quote from the paper, that it was designed to be doable by both the subjects of the program, the students, and doable by the advisors. It didn't require a crazy commitment or knowledge that the advisors didn't have. And that's because it was locally developed. This so rarely happens with practitioners, a local development. And when it doesn't, honestly, it drives us nuts, or them nuts, when the expectations are, and the components of a program are set by somebody else, and then everyone is surprised or mad at the practitioners when expectations aren't met. And I especially encourage you to read Steve's paper about HEART, because they really go into this a lot more in the paper. Along the same lines, I think it's important that researchers, and again, the authors, but everyone, understand what impact is expected and when the impact is good enough, or good in the eye of the practitioners or the students. To practitioners, a lot of times things are worth doing just on their face. And yes, of course, the thread tying these papers together was to look at long run outcomes. But this is especially important if the impact on the outcomes is something that we can't ever measure, or something that we're using proxies to measure, or something that we can't see yet. We're looking at a 5-year graduation versus a 4-year graduation. And sometimes understanding that things are sometimes just worth doing, which leads to a point raised by all the authors, the challenge around figuring out which outcomes are meaningful. And clearly all three of you wrestled with that, both in the papers that I read and in the presentations that you give. Test scores or non-tested outcomes. Steve Rivkin said, like, I wrote this down, test scores matter because they're related to other things that we care about. Like, that's why test scores matter. So when we're talking about a long-term outcome, what is it that we are looking at? Graduating in 4 years versus graduating in 5 years, or not graduating at all. And maybe 5 years is actually preferable, but we don't know that yet. For certain students at least. Is enrolling in any post-secondary institution important, or 4-year, or highly selective, or immediately after high school, or at some point after high school? High school GPA, or measures explicitly related to post-secondary like AP or SAT? Programs like the HEART program usually will have an outcome stated as this is what our goal is, but I really encourage researchers to talk with practitioners, and where appropriate, talk with the subjects, especially when they're college students or high school students. But as you're designing the model for your analysis, talk with the subjects, talk with the practitioners, talk with the experts that you are doing the research with, to find out what the right outcomes are. And also, if it's important to your participants, whether those outcomes persist or not. Again, sometimes things are just worth doing because they're worth doing at that time. In addition, it was clear that all three of you, and I know that all of us, wrestle with questions about the mechanisms. What is it that specifically that led to the outcome? The HEART program had multiple components. An effective teacher can be effective for on any number of mechanisms. Like, what is it about something that worked? In my experience, this is also a divide or a difference in thinking between a researcher and folks on the more action side of things. Practitioners are really first, not solely, but first concerned about, did this thing work, so that they can make a decision about exactly that thing in their situation. So should we keep doing it? Should we scale it up? Should we scale it back? Should we stop doing this? The why did this work question is also important, but that tends to be much more of a researchy question, because researchers are looking to pick something apart or replicate it somewhere else, or take components of something and replicate those somewhere else, or generalize findings. So practitioners care about the why also, but the question about the mechanism takes on a different level of importance. And I think that's important for everyone to consider. And also another pitch for talking to people. Practitioners are the experts in their own world, right? And so the teachers or the students or the advisors or the state education agencies, we're not just data sources, not to imply that you think that we are, but I think it's really important to keep circling back, because oftentimes we say, well, we see this impact, but we're not on the outcome, but we're not exactly sure why it worked. That's where the information about why it worked, where it worked, came from. And I realize I have 1 more minute and I only have one more thing to say, which is the thing that I wanted to circle back around to about appreciating the way that you all thought about differential effects on different groups within your studies. And I think it's important to look at those effects based on something that you think is associated with the outcome. For example, if the outcome is graduation, college graduation, it makes sense to differentiate on the number of college credits earned, because credits is how you get to graduation. Or if it's high school graduation, differentiating on achievement in 9th grade or course grades in 9th grade is associated with likelihood of graduation. So that kind of differentiation makes sense. But there needs to be a clear, explicitly stated reason to group the subjects, or even to disaggregate them in your descriptive statistics. Thinking more broadly, if there's a historical or policy reason why something would have a differential impact by race or by gender, I think that needs to be explicitly acknowledged. Otherwise, we run the risk of implicitly saying some program had a smaller or larger impact on some group because of some inherent characteristic of the group, which is not true, rather than the program had a differential impact on the group because of the way that the group has been marginalized or privileged in the past. So I think it's interesting that all of you actually said that stuff in your presentations, but you might not have in your papers. And so I encourage you and everyone to make that implicit explicit, and think about in your descriptives why you're differentiating along these different lines, and in your outcome measures why you are looking at the differential effects on these groups, why you're creating those groups in the first place. All right, that's my 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
That was terrific. Thank you so much. I'm going to leave you on here in case you want to hang with us while we're doing Q&A.
Yeah, Dan, did you act it out for everyone? Like I was really there?
Okay, so we do have time for some Q&A if people have questions. Tim, and then
Tim Sass, Georgia State and Calder. I have a non-Steve question. So for you, Ben. So we know that observational measures of teacher quality are not very highly correlated with test score value added, maybe 0.2, 0.3. do we know anything about the correlation between observational measures and non-test score value added? And if we do, what is it? Because I mean, I wonder, is it a complement or substitute to observational measures?
So pretty sure this is in an appendix table on the website. And again, pretty sure, but not totally sure that it's surprisingly more highly correlated with test-based value added than non-test value added. So this is, again, this is another puzzle like the vocal stuff, is that what we might expect to be more highly correlated with non-test value added actually ends up not being the case. But the answer for sure is on the website.
Thanks. Matt.
So I remember in some old but seminal work from Steve and Rick, I believe, they did a horse race between teacher value added and class size reduction. And there was a comparison that said if you would have to reduce class size by 10 students to equal a 1 standard deviation improvement in teacher quality.
Matt, come on, that's Rivkin et al., 2005.
Okay, yes, of course. Seminal work in Texas, I believe. I would love to see that again with some of these non-test score outcomes. And I think it's interesting because we know that the teacher test score, non-test score value added are not super highly correlated. But presumably the class score, the class size value added is highly correlated. Like it's better to have fewer students both for test scores and for non-test score value added. So I would just be curious if you guys have done that, and if so, whether we see any change in those findings.
So that's a good suggestion that will be added to the long list of things we need to investigate. So another one that people keep asking us about is the returns to teacher experience for non-test value added, and that's something else that's on the list of things we need to look at and don't know the answer to, but yes.
Hi, Allison Young from Office of State Superintendent of Education at DC. My question is for Steve Rivkin. I was really struck that the criminal justice outcomes were much more closely related to attendance value added than disciplinary infractions. And I wondered if you had any ideas about that or thoughts you wanted to share.
I think we were both struck by that too. And, you know, I think some of it, and we can look more in detail at not just using disciplinary infractions, but maybe focusing on suspensions only. But we are running these all at the same time. So it's, you know, it's disciplinary infractions, value added, conditional on their absences. And the absences may be, you know, they may be a better measure. They're easier to measure, though there's some noise there because many absences are out of the control of the school, that they happen because a child is sick or something, you know, something which is really out of the control of the school. So I think we have more investigation to do on that, because it does seem like principals could potentially and teachers could affect behavior and these ideas of self-control in ways that would reduce the probability of future engagement with the criminal justice system. And we do find it with regard to incarceration and a guilty finding.
Sonia.
For Steve, I was wondering, so you guys did a great job. I was wondering how you went about getting the Texas data, the higher education data.
Oh, you mean, the higher education data are very easy to get. So Rick and I have been part of the Texas Schools Project at the University of Texas at Dallas since its founding. And the third co-author with us on many of our papers is the late John Kane, who actually went down to Texas and really started everything there at UT Dallas. And so there are 3 education research centers in the state of Texas that are repositories for all of the data. And those data include the elementary and secondary data and the higher education data, and the Workforce Commission data. What we were able to get was the Texas Department of Public Safety to give us the computerized criminal histories that we could, you know, we have to merge it so we can track the kids. Those data are actually not confidential unlike the school data for adults, not, so we don't have any data on arrests or incarceration for anyone below 18. But there's still, I think, reluctance to distribute those data widely. So if you're interested, please get in touch. Anyone who's interested, please get in touch with Rick or with me, and we can connect you with the people at the University of Texas, Dallas.
Okay, quick question for Steve and a quick answer.
Sure.
Yeah, very quick question. Did you include part-time students in your analysis?
So great question. These are first-time, full-time, first-year students in the sample.
Patricia with NCTQ. I have a question for Ben. Just following up in the whole correlation with, climate value added and test value added. Which subjects, and are you able to split them by subjects? And the reason I'm asking this is because there's a really neat study by Simon Burgess, who finds that there are different observable characteristics and components of instruction that are better predictors for either math or ELA.
Yeah, so in the paper, we use math and ELA teachers and everything is combined together. I don't think we've checked the correlation separately, but they could be different, but it's so small that there's not a lot of scope for it to be that different because they're both, it's the overall number is so close to zero that.
Steve, you made a slight, I'm sorry, Akeisha, the council with Great City Schools. You made a slight inference around the system, the police system, maybe impacting the results that we're seeing with the over incarceration or harsher penalties for Black and brown students. And I'm just wondering if you've felt, I don't know if that was a working paper or final paper, but if you plan to have conversations with people in those space around those findings. So if that is a true finding around their role in the over incarceration of Black and brown kids.
So I think that we wanted to allow for differential relationships between a principal's effects on value added to the various skills and the probabilities that one of their students ends up being involved in the criminal justice system. And I think that as was pointed out, I mean, I think it's important to give some reasons why we might expect differences along those along the racial dimension. And I think that we don't have direct evidence on differential behaviors in Texas. Certainly we're not exploring the Department of Public Safety data. We're just using we're using the data. But certainly the levels of arrests and incarceration in particular are obviously much higher for Black students. And we didn't look separately at Hispanic students in this paper. And so, I think there's been a lot of discussion of why, and certainly differential treatment by law enforcement has been one reason that's been put forward by a lot of people. I think what will be important for us to discuss, it's probably not from a policy point of view as relevant for the Department of Public Safety as it would be for middle schools, which is what we're observing is it's particularly important and valuable when a principal is better at helping students gain these skills. And one of the reasons is because it appears that these skills are particularly important for this group of students in terms of lowering the probabilities of involvement in the criminal justice system. Why that's the case is not something that we will ever understand with these data. These are statistical relationships, but I think it's important to convey that evidence. And then I think for practitioners and people who are working in the schools and potentially people working in public safety to then take those results and work with them.
Jeff, wrap it up.
Sure. Jeff Dean, Walton Family Foundation. This is a question in reaction to one of Ben's slides, but it could be for any of you. I was really interested and had not seen before the chart showing the magnitude of test and non-test value added conditional on achievement percentiles for students. This is one of those things that feels on its surface like a common sense thing that may actually have some deeper policy significance, right? That that kids that are, kids that are high performing may not need as much behavioral value added from a teacher. Kids that are lower performing may need more, right? But I wonder if that had, like, what deeper policy significance that kind of finding might hold in terms of the transferability of value added across contexts for schools, for teachers, and just how we think about teacher labor markets, a lot of the stuff we've talked about already today. Welcome your reflections.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of what's going on for the non-test value added isn't necessarily that high achieving kids are only affected by test scores, and that's the only thing that matters for them. I think to some extent what is going on is that the measures we have available that are the non-test measures are measures that happen to be most relevant for kids that are lower down in the achievement distribution. So if you're a kid with very high test scores, then on average, you're not going to be absent a lot. On average, you're not going to be suspended from school a lot, and you're not going to be repeating grades. So that's like, these measures we aren't able to use these measures to discriminate between how teachers affect these students, just because they're 3 of the 4 measures aren't as relevant for these students, where for a test score, it's a continuous measure that's more sensitive to kids throughout the district. So this doesn't really answer the question about the policy context, but I think more about the measures that are used are more sensitive to certain types of kids that are more likely to have variation in those measures, if that makes sense.
Great. Please join me in thanking the panel and Dara. And